Spotlight.
Good evening and welcome to Spotlight. My name is Rajesh Laikh. Tonight on Spotlight, we examine India's core macroeconomic outlook, what is driving the optimism, where the risks are, and can India really make the leap to developed economy status? To discuss this, we are joined by Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya, economic analyst. A warm welcome to Spotlight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Bhattacharya, India is often called a bright spot in the global economy. If you had to pick just three pillars that best explain the resilience today, what would that be?
Well, its resilience is clearly evident in the first advanced estimates of the National Statistics Office released a day ago, which is that India's economic growth rate, measured by gross domestic product, has risen in real terms by 7.4% for 2025-26. Now, this has happened at a time when there is global economic turmoil. The country, India, is facing tariff turbulence. India's export markets have not done very well. So, taken all this together, I would say, thanks to India's economic resilience and also the impact of some of the decisions that were taken during the year to address demand as well as investment needs of the economy, I would say that a 7.4% growth rate would be something that the managers of the Indian economy should feel good about.
In fact, last year, the Prime Minister spoke of the impact of the growth in GDP, impacting the lives of the new middle class of India. Let's hear what he said.
भारत ने 2 लाख करोड़ डॉलर अपनी इकोनॉमी में जोड़े हैं। जीडीपी का डबल होना सिर्फ आंकड़ों का बदलना मात्र नहीं है। इसका इम्पैक्ट देखिए, 25 करोड़ लोग गरीबी से बाहर निकले हैं और ये 25 करोड़ लोग एक नियो मिडिल क्लास का हिस्सा बने। ये नियो मिडिल क्लास एक प्रकार से नई जिंदगी शुरू कर रहा है। ये नए सपनों के साथ आगे बढ़ रहा है, हमारी इकोनॉमी में कंट्रीब्यूट कर रहा है और उसको वाइब्रेंट बना रहा है।
So we talked about the main pillar, which is the GDP, which reflected a growth rate of over 7%. What are the other two pillars, according to you, that explains the resilience today, and what would they be and why?
A very important point that you have raised, Mr. Laikh. This is inflation. What has happened is that while the Indian economy is growing at a decent pace, we are witnessing our inflation rate, particularly the retail inflation, which is measured by the Consumer Price Index, are hovering at around 2% on an annual basis. Actually, it is less than 2%. You will remember that the Reserve Bank of India's monetary policy, the lower band of the tolerance limit is 2%. So now it is well under control. So when inflation is moderate and under control, it certainly pinches far less to the consumers, and the consumers can go out and spend a little more money, which can sustain demand. So that's the second point. And the third point is, in spite of India's exports coming under some sort of threat because of the tariff by the US president, and foreign investors, portfolio investors, pulling out $18 billion of money from the Indian markets in the calendar year of 2025, India's external sector is pretty strong, with its current account deficit still below 2% of GDP. So now, both on the GDP front and the inflation front and the external sector front, the Indian economy's resilience is quite evident. Now, inflation numbers, please remember, has reflection in the GDP numbers that were announced. If you look at the difference between the nominal GDP and the real GDP, there's hardly much of a difference. The nominal GDP growth, which includes the impact of inflation, is 8%, and the real GDP, which does not include the impact of inflation, is 7.4% for the current financial year. So it's clear that inflation has been reined in, growth has been sustained, external sector has been managed quite well, which is why I would agree with your initial assertion that India's economy has maintained its resilience.
Now, the real GDP has been estimated to grow by 7.4% in FY 2025-26, against the growth rate of 6.5% during the FY 2024-25, and the nominal GDP is estimated to grow at 8% in 25-26. How sustainable is this?
Well, sustainability will depend on kind of investment rates that we can manage. The investment rate right now is around 30% of GDP. Now, this has broadly remained at the same level. Although, if you look at the gross fixed capital formation, which is a proxy for the investment rate, this grew sharply by 7.8% in the current financial year compared to a growth of 7.1% in year ago. So, that investment rate has gone up. This investment rate has been kept buoyant largely by the government sector. The government CapEx program has played a big role in sustaining that investment. Private sector is coming in, but it is still very slow. So therefore, the big challenge going forward for the sustainability point of view is how do you make sure that the overall investment rate keeps rising and that rate stays intact. The second point, which is very, very important, is whether the demand in the economy is kept alive. Now, that demand is captured in the GDP numbers through what we call the private spending or private final consumption expenditure. Now, that is grown this year at slower level at 7% compared to 7.2% in 24-25. So, which means there is a slight deceleration in private consumption, which is demand. There is a slight acceleration in investment. So what we can see is that while investment is keeping its tempo up, but consumption or the demand side of the economy is still to chip in with its bet. Now remember that almost 60% of the economy is all about demand. Less than 40% is about investment. So if we do not ensure that consumption is also kept going by reviving demand in a wide range of areas, which is why the signs in the GDP numbers in terms of manufacturing sector doing well and the services sector doing well give us some hope, because manufacturing sector also creates jobs, services sector creates jobs. When the manufacturing sector grows by 7% this year compared to 4.5% last year, and when the services sector grows by 9.1% compared to 7.2% last year, which means there's a clear pickup in both services and manufacturing, which I hope will create more jobs and therefore more money in the hands of people, which will be disposable and they can fuel the kind of demand. Therefore, it might just go into that the private final consumption expenditure will go up. The government expenditure, which is mostly the revenue expenditure, is actually also helped this year in contributing to the GDP number. But I think the government revenue expenditure should not be relied upon, because it is the private consumption expenditure which should keep the economy's wheels moving at a faster pace.
So you mentioned 60% of the whole GDP is about demand. Rural economy is significantly coming forward and consumption there is increasing. So going forward, you think that rural consumption will be one of the factors driving the economy?
Agriculture has not done very well. The growth rate, the real growth rate, has actually decelerated to around 3.1% compared to 4.6% in 2024-25. And if you look at the nominal growth rate in agriculture for the current year, it is actually in the negative zone because prices have not really gone up there at all. On the contrary, there has been deflation. So if agriculture does not do very well, which means the money is generated, the value-added money, the income that is generated is not too well, then the rural demand may not sustain for long. And if the rural economy does not revive, then I would say that even a large segments of the manufacturing sector or the services sector may come under some adverse impact. So we need to be conscious that agriculture in the current year has not done that well. Therefore, there is need, and we are going to see a budget in the next few weeks. And as I told you earlier, that these numbers are the first concrete input into budget making for the coming budget. And the budget, I'm sure, is watching these numbers, and you can expect some policy announcements which addresses those agriculture sector, the MSME sector, how to boost consumption and also sustain investment.
The Prime Minister also pointed out that 7.8% growth, despite challenges, speaks volumes about the economic resilience of the country.
इस साल के पहले क्वार्टर के जीडीपी नंबर आए हैं। एक बार फिर भारत ने हर उम्मीद, हर अपेक्षा, हर आकलन से भी बेहतर प्रदर्शन किया है। एक तरफ जब दुनिया भर की इकोनॉमी में चिंताएं हैं, आर्थिक स्वार्थ से पैदा हुई चुनौतियां हैं, उस माहौल में भारत ने 7.8% की ग्रोथ हासिल करके दिखाई है और ये ग्रोथ हर सेक्टर में है। मैन्युफैक्चरिंग, सर्विसेज, एग्रीकल्चर, कंस्ट्रक्शन, हर तरफ उत्साह नजर आ रहा है। भारत आज जितनी तेजी से ग्रो कर रहा है, इससे हम सभी में, इंडस्ट्री में, हर देशवासी में नई ऊर्जा का संचार हो रहा है। ग्रोथ की यही दिशा है तो भारत को थर्ड लार्जेस्ट इकोनॉमी बनाने की तरफ तेजी से बढ़ना पक्का हो चुका है।
My next question to you is, looking at the next 3 to 5 years, what is your baseline view of India's GDP growth path? Are we talking about a steady 6 to 7%, something higher, or do you expect a gradual slowdown as the global environment tightens?
Well, the challenges are there. But I think what in 2025 we saw in terms of many reform steps, in terms of the budget that is fueling capital investment into the economy, I would say that a lot depends on the impact of the GST rate rationalization, the income tax rationalization, and ease of doing business, steps to encourage more foreign investment into the economy, and India's ability to sign up new free trade agreements. They will determine the manner in which we sustain our growth rate. Achieving a growth rate of 6 to 7% with India's demographic dividend or demographic profile will not be a very difficult task. The important goal to achieve would be how we can raise our economic growth to more than 8% or 8.5% or even 9%. So I think that is what will determine our India's growth trajectory.
So to what extent is India really insulated from global shocks such as higher interest rates in advanced economies, oil prices spikes, or disruptions in major trade routes? Where are we most exposed today?
We are not really insulated. We are exposed to the oil price shocks. For example, we continue to import oil from Russia, even though it is a lower quantum, because we are getting oil at better price. So therefore, our vulnerability to oil supply is very much there. We need to get into new export agreements, free trade agreements like we did with the United Kingdom. We have done it with Oman. We have done it with UAE, Australia, New Zealand. So therefore, it will be very important that we get into a similar agreement like maybe European Union, which is expected. So these will determine our ability to export and sustain growth in exports. And the exports and manufacturing are very interlinked. And if we have done this manufacturing growth rate 7% in the current year, I would say that if exports is also sustained, our manufacturing and services growth rates will also be positively impacted.
My last question to you is, India has set an ambitious goal of becoming a developed economy by 2047. In hard economic terms, Dr. Bhattacharya, what kind of average growth rate would we need over the next 2 decades? And what are the 1 or 2 most critical reforms to make that realistic?
There are many estimates already available that we need to grow by over 8 and 8.5 or close to 9% per year, which is a difficult task. And what we need to do is that we had undertaken very bold and ambitious agriculture sector reforms in 2020, but we abandoned them. So I think we should revisit those agricultural reforms. We need to reform our social infrastructure areas, particularly skilling and education, healthcare and water. And most importantly, we must ensure that we implement and ensure the enforcement of the new labor codes that have just been announced by the government.
On that note, Dr. Bhattacharya, would like to thank you for laying the promise and the risks in India's economy so vividly before our listeners. Thank you for being with Akashvani.
Thank you.
Listeners, you can also listen to this program, Spotlight, on our mobile app, News on AIR, and our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official.
Spotlight.